Mr. and Mrs. Stagg, Grant Putnam here. Tuesday evening. Just want to make sure I get that estimate out to you. I mentioned I'll get back to you at the beginning of the week. So anyways, I just want to quickly go through the design and some of the revisions that we spoke about when we were at your house. So we'll start left and kind of work our way around the house. All right, so we talked about adding perennials in between. This is the walkway that leads to your driveway, but in between the walkway that leads to your side door, this is your garage right here that goes to the driveway. So 8 perennials in here. Some astilbe, which were existing. Talking about putting something in more shade tolerant, so I said just an American boxwood potentially makes sense here. Okay. Lilac off the corner, which was per design. Shrub B, you're going to notice on the quote I gave you several options that will do well in the shade. Okay. The American holly, which was originally planned in the design, if you look online, it's going to grow way too big for this corner. So I suggested using green mountain boxwood instead. I have a source of green mountain boxwood roughly about 5 feet tall at a much better price than what they would typically cost. So I had one here and one here. Okay. In this area, again, green velvet boxwoods, 24 to 26 inch wide for this area and this area over here. They originally had suggested using a mop head hydrangea, which sometimes flowers, sometimes doesn't. That's what you have over in this area. Okay, but my thought process was planting something that will flower every year and something that's going to stay more dwarf so it doesn't block the plants you're planting next to the foundation of your house. So I suggested an invincible wee hydrangea. All right, that'll grow only about 3 feet tall and blooms white, and it blooms every year. You don't have to worry about it not blooming because it blooms on new wood, whereas macrophylla hydrangeas, the blue flowers over here, bloom on last year's buds. Okay, so those sometimes are at risk of not blooming for that reason. Then we suggested using compacta andromeda because the andromeda they suggested were going to grow too short. I believe they had caventine andromeda, which is not going to grow tall enough for this area. Okay. Again, the green mountain boxwood, which I mentioned before, which would frame the corners of the house. Then the 2 bloodgood maples, which I think would be fine choices. The one thing I want to mention is the way I quoted it is I quoted it as using actually a little bit larger maples than what the architect had spec'd, actually quite a few years bigger. Typically very, very expensive maples, but again, I have a source from a farm that I can dig and buy those direct versus having to buy them from a local wholesaler. And they're gorgeous, and I can install them for about half the price that you'd have to pay from any other landscaper in the area for the same size tree. Okay, so those are the 2 bloodgood maples. Shade perennials in here because I think they had nepeta, and the problem is there wasn't enough sunlight for nepeta. Okay. Liriope underneath the canopies of these 2 trees, which I think still makes sense. Okay, that was originally planned. Get rid of the skip laurel. Those get very, very bad winter burn. Those are all bought West Coast and shipped over here, and then most of the ones that we've installed in the past we've replaced for customers because they weren't happy with how they looked coming out of the winter. Okay, so I gave you a few good options that will work in here. Plus, it's a pretty good distance of fence, so rather than only put 3 plants, my suggestion is putting 4 plants. You'll notice I made that change. Okay. Then rather than using a taller spirea, I suggest using a dwarf spirea, so it only grows about 3 feet tall versus the other one grows 5 feet tall, which kind of defeats the whole purpose of, having a layered effect where you have shorter and then taller. Plus the 5 foot tall will grow right into the tree, so that didn't make any sense, what they originally had. Then to kind of mirror the other side, we had the invincible wee hydrangea here and the same thing over here, which was their original plan, but they were going to end up using a taller, larger hydrangea that's going to grow too big. Okay. So we kept the 4 okami cherries. That's a beautiful tree. What I do is that's my favorite cherry tree. So every spring I buy about 30 of those at a good value size, 3 to 3.5 inch caliper. The ones I have are not picked over. They're gonna be a much higher quality than what you're gonna be able to get, what a local landscaper is gonna be able to buy from a wholesale nursery locally. So again, we buy in these trees direct, right from a farm. Nothing. Most of them are coming out of New Jersey down in North Carolina, which is where most of the plants are grown. And those plants are typically shipped up to a wholesale nursery. Then the wholesale nursery typically sells to a landscaper sells to you. So we're essentially cutting out the middleman. Most of the plants we're not buying from a wholesale nursery, we're buying in direct. And it gives us a big pricing advantage when it comes to really, really high quality material at a good price. Okay, so the 1, 2, 3, 4. Then we reduce some of the variety in this area because there's too many elements in one area. So you'll notice that we made a few changes in this area. So that's it. So in regards to the quote, if we're looking at this, I broke it down into 3 sections. The first section is plant, shrubs, trees, all right? And everything's itemized, so it's going to talk about the mulch, the bed preparation, all right? Then it gets down into the trees, so it talks about the bloodgood maples. One thing I want to point out, like I mentioned before, is trees. A lot of trees are sold not by their height, but by their caliper. Caliper is the diameter of the trunk of the tree, and it's going to represent the age of the tree, which also is going to represent how thick your branch structure is and how developed your branch structure is on the tree. So obviously the older the tree, the better it's going to look. I'm able to, again, one of I think my biggest pricing advantages are on some of the more pricey items on your quote, some of them where most of your budget is going to go into. But I'm able to install 4 to 5 inch caliper cherry bloodgood maples versus the architect's spec 3 to 3.5 inch caliper. So it's about 3-4 year older tree. It's gonna have a much more developed branch structure. If you were gonna buy that tree from someone locally and they had to buy it from a wholesaler, they're gonna have to charge you about $2,100 per tree to make a profit. So we're charging you $1,300 per tree for that 4 to 5 inch caliper, 10 to 12 feet tall, and it's going to be roughly somewhere between 8 to 10 feet wide. And gorgeous tree. I could send you pictures as well of the trees that we're suggesting. And the Pruno Socami, like I mentioned before, we buy those trees in direct. I could also send you pictures of those, but also really gorgeous trees. Okay, so shrubs. So these are a list of all your shrubs with all the sizes. So those are your sizes, those are your quantity, and there's various options. You'll notice some items, like this item here, to substitute for the skip laurel, I gave you 3 other options with pricing and sizing. Okay. And again, whenever I have a pricing advantage, I'm going to point that out within the quote. So you'll notice a lot of times you'll say normally what it cost. Same thing, the Green Mountain boxwood, for that 5 to 5.5 foot boxwood is usually in the neighborhood of $750 a piece, and I'm charging $550. Okay. That big American boxwood, same ordeal. Typically very expensive, and I buy it in quantity on tractor trailers, so I'm able to provide a better deal. Okay. So beyond price, obviously there is a price, and the most important thing that we stress is our communication channel with you, our expertise level in regards to designing it properly, locating it properly at the house. So we're thinking about what the design is going to look like 10, 15 years from now, not what it's going to look like when it's first installed, which is typically one of the bigger problems you have. You have designers who are putting plants in the wrong location, whether that be sunlight conditions or the wrong size plant in the wrong area, or just lack of experience. So right now we're doing 5 design build projects all at the same time. We have a crew of about 35 people, and each crew is specialized in what they do. We also have, like I mentioned, a 4-acre holding yard, much like a nursery would, that we buy in all of our material and source it a little bit more smart than what most guys can do, just because of the volume that we're doing of work. So we're able to buy tractor trailer loads of trees, which obviously gives us a pricing advantage when we're buying it directly from a farm who's growing it, rather than the guy who's buying it from a re-wholesaler. Okay, so subtotal for your plants came out to around 15,000 and change. Then the masonry work, I spec that, and if you watch the video that's coordinating with the quote, that explains a lot of the masonry work, and that came out to about $6,100. And then the outdoor lighting, I suggested a few more lights than what the architect had spec'd, so I had 15 lights total, and that came out to roughly $3,800. So the whole project came out to about $25,000